Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. A few things I have to say. One is, we personally are involved both as a lifestyle, the ketogenic diet, but also through my 16 years of clinical practice of what is effective. What do people need to take sometimes, all the time, to support their ketogenic diet? You'll get bits and pieces of this ongoing week after week. It's important to be comprehensive. In one way it's simple, and one way it's a little bit complicated.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Carl Goldkamp back for another episode of the Keto Naturopath. So we're going to continue and working with, and I'm always reluctant to say newbie Brian, but Brian, who's new to the ketogenic diet. This is our third in a series of interviews, coaching sessions in essence with Brian. We're going to check into how he's doing, what changes, what his experience has been. He was, unlike a lot of people, he's tech savvy. And that means in this particular case, we share a common data gathering app, specifically on him, called Chronometer. And he likes it a lot, and that's what's important. And so I get to check in on the food he's eating. And these are things that I'm not going to be critical of for a while now, but I get to monitor. So if I see something drastic, and this guy is so, Brian is so determined to make this work, it kind of scares me. But I would say all good stuff. So, Brian,
yes,
tell me, how has this last week been? You know what? Give me the general, and then we'll break it down to some specifics, and I'll ask you questions.
This week was definitely much more different characteristically than last week. I noticed at the beginning of the week, I gained a little bit of weight, which was kind of cool considering, because I was feeling kind of strange going through the initial changes. So gaining a little bit of weight actually felt good, but there was some physical changes that I felt while I was training jiu-jitsu. All of my sessions up until my very last session, which was yesterday in the evening, I would find myself getting fatigued very, very quickly. I'd find myself getting short of breath very, very quickly. And I'd find myself in those scenarios that I know that I should be comfortable in, almost feeling like a panic, because I feel myself, getting short of breath. I feel myself getting fatigued, getting gassed out. Well, that was at the beginning of the week. That was on Tuesday night. Last night, here we are 5 days later. For whatever reason, I figured it was going to be more of the same. However, I had a lot more stamina. I didn't even break a sweat until my second or third round, which is, for me recently, is pretty unheard of. But my shortness of breath was completely gone. The only time I had any trouble was literally when I would be against a partner who maybe outweighed me by 50 some odd pounds. So that was pretty amazing. I did more consecutive rounds than I had ever done, and here I am today. I actually don't feel any soreness. I actually feel good that I worked out. But I noticed a few other things regarding how I feel. I know I shouldn't be really paying attention to how many calories I take in, but I'm at a point right now where I see myself eating so little that I'm kind of trying to force myself to eat a little bit more. And for me, what I've noticed, a day where I feel like where I've satiated all of my hunger and do all of that, seems like roughly 1,400 to 1,600 some odd calories. If I do more than that, I'll feel like maybe I ate too much, throughout the day. But usually anywhere around there is fine. But I'm realizing that I feel equally as fine on the days that I only have maybe roughly 700, 800, 900 calories. So definitely confusing for sure. But also still feeling really good. My sleep is definitely so much better. That was one of the first improvements that I saw, but now my quality of sleep has been getting a lot better too. So that's been really great. But that's pretty much where I've been at this last week. I did notice that my blood sugar, I don't even think at all this week, it never even got above 80, according to what I recorded here. But objectively, that's really all I'm really looking at.
That's impressive. I'm going to go back. We'll get to the blood sugar. I'm glad you're tracking that. That's probably the first thing. And so back to your working out. So you went through a phase of being tired, which you certainly should. And from my understanding, so from the academic aspect of this, is that when one transitions into keto, and it's really a 6 months to a year transition, but obviously you get the bigger parts happen right up front, is that your on-demand sugar supply, which is your glycogen stored in your muscle, that access, so your stored glycogen actually starts to decrease. So these are now a lot of studies by Volek and Finney out of University of Ohio State. But what they find is initially you start to deplete. That is, you can't restore your glycogen. So you have this, you're starting with a half a tank of gas instead of a full tank of gas. Well, eventually it comes back and your body learns to adjust to completely protect is the word they use, and you have 100% glycogen nearly all the time, except obviously when you're using it, then it goes down. So that's an interesting transition. And it sounds like to overlay that piece of information to your story, it's like, your body's learning to adapt. And now you've not only been, you're fat adapted, you're burning that, but while you're working out, you're always burning glucose. And now it's kind of finding a medium. It'd be interesting to hear those stories going forward. It's a really telling sign.
It definitely felt really great because, now it's like, when you're physically going through that, walking into a jiu-jitsu gym, you know that you're going to have a really bad time. Like whether you enjoy the time or not, it's just going to be hard. So knowing that, walking in, feeling like, oh man, like I'm going to be trapped for the next hour and a half and I'm not going to be able to breathe or feel like I can do anything. I'm just going to get basically pummeled for the next, duration. But being able to feel more like myself, that I can go, I can be quick, I could react. I'm not going to feel dead. That's really super important because a lot of jiu-jitsu happens to be psychological.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. A lot of mental. Did you have any sort of external observations about people that knew you and you're in that area and then jiu-jitsu gym saying, hey, you're either doing well, you're not doing well, you lost weight, hey, what are you doing? Or it's not noticeable now, it's all kind of in the mind of Brian?
I actually used to compete with that gym, and I was one of those guys who would notice when certain members of the gym wouldn't be showing up to class because I would always be there. So after injury, after gaining weight, after having to, deal with a transition regarding career in this last year and a half, my time at the gym has really dwindled down. So now really I'm only getting back. Being able to go twice in a week is actually great for me, but I'm trying to commit to 2, 3, 4 times a week now. So now that I'm only just coming back, these guys they're seeing the changes, they're seeing me go more rounds, which is good, but they're not seeing any noticeable physical differences because I was much smaller when I was actually competing with them. So we're going to see as this progresses what this is going to, how that's going to change.
Nice. Well, good. We'll keep an eye on that. So you talked about sleep. Sleep perchance to dream. Are you having any dreams?
I can't remember if earlier this week, if it was me waking up or if it was me dreaming, but I had some sort of lucid experience earlier on in the week, which was really interesting. But for the most part, all that I have been noticing is just that my quality of sleep is better. I feel actually rested when I wake up in the morning, which is really great. So I think I'm more or less going down that path. I know I mentioned this last week, but now it's not so much my ability to focus, but more my desire to remain focused has gone up, which I thought was kind of interesting because I guess we all have it in us to be focused. It's just whatever is distracting you. And I guess for me, it was needing those little sugar kicks throughout the day, whether it was eating, making myself a coffee, something like that throughout the day to sort of keeping me busy. But I don't do that nearly as much. In fact, I'm even kind of making excuses to sort of stay and remain on a task because I feel like mentally I prefer it. I almost enjoy it now.
Good response. So what do you do? What is your water fluid intake? I mean, it's important for all of us, but specifically now that you're a guy who works out as well.
Yeah, that's actually something that I actually wrote down here that I wanted to talk to you about was the water. I get incredibly thirsty, man. I realize that I don't drink enough. So what I'll try to do is drink roughly around 2 liters in a day. And if I don't get that throughout my day, I'll usually load up on water before bed, or I'll chug a couple bottles in the morning before I start my day. But I forget to drink water, so I need to actually be more diligent about that. But it looks like for me, I get thirsty at least once per hour, to the point where I actually have to physically get up and go get myself something to drink. Where normally thirst would be something that I would almost be able to completely ignore for hours and hours on end.
Just putting it out there is that we've mentioned it before, is your thirst actually will decrease. And so it ends up being through this transition being probably the 6 months or so, you're going to be more mentally aware that you need to drink water as opposed to feeling that. So the fact that you're thirsty, that's great. I think your thirst is going to go away, which is not necessarily a good thing because it's just what happens when your insulin goes down. It tends to require you to take less salt and therefore your thirst. So there's that. So pay attention to that. That's good because if you don't drink, especially you working out, you'll at some point you're going to find out you're going to cramp at some point, and we can address that when it happens. But that's one of those things I'm anticipating. Maybe it won't happen, but water is one of the easiest ways to address that. And after that, we can get more sophisticated. But if one isn't doing water, they're going to get into problems sooner than later.
Oh, okay.
Well, good for you. So your glucose, you really have nothing to worry about, except you did have one day that was down to 66, which by itself is actually a great number, except you're a new person starting. You're also a new person starting that already, you started with good numbers. Your numbers were in the 80s. And, that's pretty much what we tell people. This is now, we have two worlds. The world that existed before all these people on ketosis are doing their glucometer. So when we have these numbers and we're trying to compare to a population out there, that population is based on people who had a fairly high percentage of carbohydrates in their diet. So what I'm saying is these are the numbers that we know were healthy, optimal, quote unquote, optimal numbers, but that whole population was pretty high carb eating. So those numbers were 80. I think that the new norm is probably going to be in the 70s. So that's kind of like where my comfort zone is around watching you, the 80s, the 70s. If it goes down to 60s, we'll keep an eye on it. But my questions would be, and I appreciate you reaching out and contacting me at those times, how else do you feel? Do you feel lightheaded? And if there are all these other things, and the answer is eat. It's like there's no crime here. You didn't cheat on anything. There is no cheating here. It's impossible to cheat. You're doing life. It's your life. Okay. And so that's it. So it's not meant to be a mental exercise, and you haven't made it that. I see that. You've been great at keeping data, but never feel that, oh my gosh, that I'm just going to push myself through it. There's not that much pushing. It's happening by itself.
Regarding what I'm eating, I just wanted to go over something with you really quick. Based on how my time and my scheduling works out, especially now that I'm trying to take more time to actually be at the gym, that takes time regarding cooking for myself to go down. I feel like I'm kind of quasi-cheating, but I find myself eating eggs maybe at least once a day. I've been trying to skip some days if I can, but I know that growing up I've been told left and right, you can't eat too many eggs, it's bad for your cholesterol. Should I be concerned about getting too much of a certain type of protein, like eggs, for example?
No, if you did that for 10 years and ate nothing but eggs, I think we'd have a study there. We can come up with that definitive answer. But no, I think eggs are the perfect food to have as your backup, your go-to food. When we go on long car trips, we take hard-boiled eggs, in a cooler, and you get hungry, then you pull it out and have an egg. So, but I know the context, what you're talking about. We collectively did grow up saying, oh, wait a minute, eggs are bad. They're going to, the yolks particular we're talking about, they're going to increase your cholesterol, and your increased cholesterol is bad. Well, two things are being challenged in that. And the question behind that, can you actually eat food that is going to directly increase your cholesterol? Well, you can to an extent, but most of the cholesterol in your body, over 80% of the cholesterol in your body, is produced by the liver. It's not by the food that you eat. And it's not by your food being converted into cholesterol. So it's just a minor contribution and pretty negligible at that. And so in terms of eggs, I think they are perfect. You have a number of things in there, but you have choline, which is good for the brain. You have phosphatidylcholine, which is it's also good for the nerves. Anyway, you can go in and in and in about that. Until you get bored with eggs are good. I would have, if you get to the point of, and I think this is a good way of thinking, what is my backup food? Because I never feel you need to be stretched. So what's your backup food when you're out there? If you can make a little box of, mixed sardines or something or other, that's another great little backup food to have. Rip open a can of sardines. I like that. If you like sardines, that is. I like that because you get your omega-3s and it's great protein and so on. But that kind of thinking, what's my stash going to be? Is my stash going to be part of last night's leftovers? You bring them with you and there you go. So never leave yourself, if you feel this way, and it's the way I think, never leave yourself without that easy reach of good food that basically is going to keep bad choices from getting back into your diet. But you're so on it. You're so on it. I don't see that happening, but it's just a good way of thinking.
Did I already speak to you about my experience at the gym? I did, right?
Yeah, yes, you did. Let me ask you a question then from that context, because it is a lot of mental. It's not just physical. If it was just physical, you'd be working with weights, but this is pretty mental. You got to be agile. How would you assess your mental focus?
I was able to keep any adrenaline and any excitement at bay and just was able to apply every technique that I wanted to actually use and was successful in almost everything, which is kind of uncommon considering, I was going against guys who were technically better than me and had a lot more experience. So it was really cool that I was able to find myself enough time to actually think, be calm, and be able to execute.
What about at work when you're grinding away at all the technical stuff you got to do there?
I've been finding myself chipping away at my work a lot faster, but I know a lot of that has to do with me being on task for longer periods of time. Whether it be me being distracted by somebody or me getting up to get food or, making an excuse to go get coffee, whatever the case may be, I just do a lot less.
Well, any observations from the people you work with about you, behavior, anything?
I actually, you know what? I've been asked twice this week if there was something wrong. My whole life, people have always asked me if something was up with me because I have a very serious face when I concentrate. And a lot of people think that I might be upset about something. I don't know why, but it's always been like this, even since I was a little kid. So I actually think that that's actually a positive thing because that means I'm going back to my very pensive, focus types of it, which is actually kind of a good thing considering.
Yeah, that's funny. That's good. Good. I'm looking at your chart right now as we're talking, and I see that in basically 2 weeks, you've dropped to, at least yesterday, last time you inputted information, nearly 14 pounds, 13.4 pounds. And that's significant. I mean, I know you have your targets, and I know we're going to get there, but that's a significant drop in 14 days. Has anybody, and that's going to show, has anybody looked at you and said, yeah, you're different physically? Your face is different.
Yes, I have. My buddy Eric, who's obsessed with working out, he actually trains. He wants to do the Highland Games. So that's like his world and like what he does. He does that, and he also trains martial arts at another gym. I saw him for the first time in about a week or so, and he actually said that there actually was a noticeable difference.
So Brian, I know you're drawn to this, and you're a guy who's, you have a kind of a military mindset in terms of, here's my objective, I'm going to achieve it, come hell or high water. And I appreciate that. And I'm sort of trying to soften it up a little bit for you. But what has been the most uncomfortable part of this? Has there been a part that, I know that people with your mindsets tend not to think this way. But I'm asking you to back up and saying, what is the thing that annoys you, or you wish could be different, or you're just going to force yourself to get over it because that's how you are? Anything like that?
Okay, all right. The one thing that kind of like bugs me out a little bit is getting used to eating really fatty foods or choosing not to remove fat off of something while I'm eating it. What makes it difficult for me, once certain foods get cold that are fatty, then it gets extra tough for me, and I almost don't even want to attempt trying to eat it.
Yep. That's an interesting point. And by the way, a lot of people say that. And so one of the things are, that's why I gave you sort of the mayo recipe is like, well, how do you make the fat part interesting? Because everybody can figure out their proteins, and it's usually fish or chicken or eggs or meat. And they got that, and they go, oh, I need this fat part. So what some people do that are not bothered by dairy, they just start lopping on the butter. I don't, because I do have a kind of a problem with dairy. So I add, the C8, but having a backup, that whole fat category that you mentioned is kind of the category of people going, huh, what's this? And yet, what's going to happen in the big picture, we're talking 6 months or a year down the road, is that once you get fat comfortable, I'm not even talking about fat adapted or keto adapted, once you get comfortable with that, you're probably going to then start pulling back down a little bit on the fat, especially since you work out, because you're going to want to get your leaner body. Once that starts showing up, you're going to like it. But right now, increasing your fat portion, and you've been doing fine. I mean, your data is you're like a robot almost, and that's fine. But that is an odd sensation to get over, and so therefore, making your little condiments that are good, that you like, that you can add into what you're doing. Like if it's the egg, you make it into the egg salad with the fat that you made. Then you go, oh, that's the way I had that, even though yolks are fatty, but things like that. And then once you get beyond that, then that's never an issue. But yeah, if you think about, oh, I got to eat this old bacon fat. Well, no, that's not very appealing when it's cold. You're right.
I didn't have as much fibrous stuff this week. If you look at the foods that I had, and like digestion wise, I felt like it was a little tough for me. This is probably gonna be super obvious, but I should definitely be making sure that I get some amount of fiber every day, right?
Well, the former, if you met me when I was practicing, I was saying absolutely. Fiber makes the world go round. I'm less sure about that. I think in the transition, it certainly helps you transition to a high fat and protein, but I would say let it work in, whether it's a salad or something like that. I wouldn't go for some sort of extraneous source like I'm going to add psyllium. Psyllium's not bad. You can add other sources of fiber, but I think it's not the holy piece of our diet that we once thought it was. But if you feel, usually what happens when people stop having the fibrous foods, which is kind of like, are you counseling no fiber? I'm not counseling no fiber, but I'm counseling not being conscious of, adding fiber into your diet, is I think that, people are going to get constipated, they're going to get bloated, and so on and so forth. Usually what happens is just the opposite, that when people stop eating fiber or even all carbs, so dropping from large amounts of carbs to very low carbs, perhaps even no carbs, obviously the fiber is going to drop down. So the bowel movements they have per week drops down pretty significantly. That becomes the norm. But the number one thing people report is that they do not feel as bloated. And these are not even people who knew that they were bloated before or had any sort of digestive issues. And so it throws the value of fiber into question. And fiber used to be the thing. Fiber was wonderful. Here's a little bit of a tangent, but everything has its virtue. It's like when we would have women come into the practice and they had irregular cycles, and you measure their hormones and so on and so forth. In part, what we would look at is that if they had a diet that was very low fiber, in other words, a refined diet, they were eating, I won't say junk food, but everything was refined, that if you added in fiber, you would bring back their cycle. And the reason you would do that is because the fiber would actually bind, when your body breaks down various estrogen and hormones and everything, it goes through the liver pops it into the intestine, and it goes out with a stool. That's no big surprise. Well, the problem is it also gets reabsorbed if it's not bound to various fiber. So these women, and it's not uncommon, would have the liver do their thing with their hormones, but then they would reabsorb what they call unconjugated estrogens, and that would give them the problem. So by giving fiber, who knew? If you're giving them fiber, you would reduce all that and they're back to their cycle. So fiber was important, but I don't think it's exclusively as important. And I think that other foods can play that same role. And there's other things that, so it's amazing. The context is it's not just a dead piece of food that goes through and helps our microbiome develop to being really diversified. There's that too, but we're in a place of reevaluating. If you feel you need it, add it. If not, not. If you're uncomfortable, add a little, look more towards your salads and things like that for your whole foods, quote unquote, source of fiber, as opposed to adding in.
Okay. What is your stance on protein supplements?
I'm not a big proponent. It's so funny. You should have seen our practice for huge supplements and everything. I'm not a big fan anymore. I put that now into the area of refined foods. It's no different than a refined carb. It's a refined protein, but I wouldn't say don't do it. If one is into, I go to the gym as well, and you can bet these guys they're taking their protein supplements. I would say if they would if they're very low carb, which I don't think any of them are, then I'd say increase your proteins in terms of whole food proteins, all the categories of proteins. But if they weren't, then it probably suits them to take a protein supplement. They're thinking about muscle mass and so on and so forth, et cetera. But I tend to defer to whole food sources because I've seen strength increase. I've seen it does have the same effect. Is it more efficient with a protein? I think it's more immediate depending on are we talking about, whey isolate or something else? And that's helpful. But it's not to say the double negative that other proteins are not equally helpful, but they're a little bit slower. So when you change the diet, you're going to feel strength come around. But if you're feeling, and this is an interesting piece of reevaluation on my part and other people's as well, is that we calculated out when we did your macros, or you did anyway, per the instructions in the Facebook group and so on, that X amount of protein is what you needed. If you feel you need more protein, have more protein, because, and people used to be and still are, if they're getting started, oh, if I have more protein, it's going to be eventually converted into glucose, and therefore my glucose levels are going to go up. My blood glucose levels are going to go up. That's called, gluconeogenesis, making new glucose from protein. Well, I haven't found that to be true. I have not found that to be true, and my protein consumption is far over the calculated macro. And I think that outcome, converting glucose from protein, because you're taking too much protein, more than the body needs, happens in the context of having a substantial amount of carbs. So I think it's carb driven allows that to happen, but I haven't seen it happen. And I've heard other people say that as well. So I would, if you're feeling constrained with protein, have more protein. If you want to have a protein, if and when you do start having a protein supplement, I would say take your, have your glucose you're taking before and after, and that would be interesting to see if that source of protein increases your glucose, as opposed to the steak you had in the morning or at night or whenever you have it, or the fish or the chicken.
One thing that I'm a little concerned about is, let's say I keep going down, and yeah, I get it. I'm 5'5", so I can understand why I might feel comfortable with maybe a 1,500, 1,600 a day calorie, why that range might feel good, because I'm physically speaking, even though I'm heavier, I'm a smaller person. I'm curious if me not exceeding or only being around 1,000, 1,100 calories in a day for several days in a row, if, doing something like that before or after the gym might actually make me feel better regarding recovery.
I would say that I would plug, if you're not feeling good after your workouts, and we're all kind of tired after a good workout, you should feel kind of tired. But if you feel you need sort of something to help you get back to normal, give that a shot. My only perspective, my only little variable that I'm looking through is what it does to your glucose levels. And so if it passes muster there, fine. If we find that it spikes it, well, then we'll look at those results and figure out how to work around it. That's it. But yeah, I don't want you not to feel good after working out because you feel you're doing this thing.
It's not comparable to the day where I reached out to you about my low glucose reading at 66. When I first started, the first week, when I ended up training, I felt all of the salt, I would feel the salt when I would sweat. It would get into my eyes, it would burn. And I didn't notice until yesterday that I actually have none of that. And I'm curious as to what's happening to the salt in my body right now.
Well, it comes back to the kind of thirst idea, and it's an interesting transition. And I wouldn't say we're going into unknown territory, but so what happens when you back off on the carbs? Your insulin drops. It doesn't fall like a stone, but you're less demand. It doesn't have to be used as much, and so your pancreas gets kind of a free lunch. Well, your insulin, nobody does one thing. And insulin's a hormone, by the way. So no hormone, lives in a world and just has one job. It affects, its buddies, its friends and families, and 10 different other reactions. And so one of those other reactions is it affects the kidneys, and it directly tells the kidney, if you will, to how much salt it should absorb or not. And so you're absorbing less salt, you're taking in less salt, hence your less thirst. And so you actually have less salt. If you were to measure your blood, your electrolytes would probably are coming back in balance, but you might notice sodium and magnesium being a little bit low initially. And so you basically have less salt to give away, and your body's sort of adjusting that. Whereas before, you had buku, you were absorbing the salt from the food you ate, from all the carbs. Remember, the carbs are your carbon water food, right? Carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. And so you had all that stuff. And so you were sweating salt because you had a lot to give away. Now it's coming back to kind of a norm of what it should be like. So it's a transition. Interesting observation. Salt is one of the things, by the way, but salt is one of the things that if people don't pay attention to it, it's probably the number one simplest thing you could do. So if there were two Brians out there, or two people that are starting, and one didn't know anything about salt and went on and did the carbs, did the protein, did the fats, and they'd say, I just go through these phases of just feeling tired. I don't know what this is. It'd go on for months, might even go on for a year or so. Mm-hmm. And if they just knew to add add salt. So I add salt to every cup of coffee I have. I add salt to, whereas before I never had salt. It wasn't I avoided it. Salt wasn't a thing that I was drawn to, but I put in salt, Himalayan salt. It can be any kind of salt as long as it's not, it could be sea salt. But adding salt to whatever you do should be part of your discipline as well. So it's good we're talking about that. It's the number one thing. And this is like from Olympians or endurance athletes that have learned. It's like, well, their recovery was slow. They felt about this. It's just so tired. Who thought that it wasn't about protein so much? It wasn't about carbs or glucose and so on. It was about salt. So if there's one thing, there was more of a discipline than anything else, and I'm saying everything else shouldn't be a discipline. It should kind of like naturally flow. Salt will have to be the discipline. You take a pinch. So we have it on our counter, wherever it is. Take a pinch. We bring it with us when we travel. Salt. And I was never one. I don't think I started having salt until like 3 years ago. So now it's a big deal. And even though that's another context of, wait a minute, if you have salt, salt's bad for your cardiovascular. And, it's hype. Forget about that. Add salt. It's very important. And you're going to find your fatigue will disappear.
That's basically everything for me. That was literally all the questions that I had regarding, our conversation for today. I don't know if you had anything else for me.
Well, I was just going to give you sort of like an overview. It's like, as I look at your data, at first I'm impressed. You dropped, call it 14 pounds in 2 weeks. You're going to have significant, and I like the fact that it bounced up a little bit. It wasn't this like stock market crash, line on your weight chart. So that going down, that's a good thing because you have, we know your numbers before, you had a lot to lose. And so I like that, but so there's that. It was actually, that was dramatic. The other is, I see the amount of calories you're looking at, what you're eating, and they're sometimes about not quite half, but sometimes it's half of what you should be eating. Right now, I'm not too bothered, but I'm now thinking about, I bet you if you have some salt, we're going to have some calories come up a little bit, just a little bit, and I will see that as a good thing. So I'm not worried that I'm looking at days you've had under 1,000 calories, a couple days. You've had 1, 2, 3, 4 days under 1,000 calories, considering you should have about 2,500. Given you where we are right now, it's like, that's okay. If you had the next 15 days at 900 calories, I'd be a little concerned, but we know people fast for 3 weeks, and that's fine. So, but water's important, salt's important. And if you did those and you really were just eating when you felt you were hungry, I'd be good with that. So I guess I see salt through all this and do that. And I don't want you to starve. And as long as you're not mentally being this, I say, militant about going to get this thing done come hell or high water, is that, well, life's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And we're going to get there. We got 2 months. And let's not break the fence over this one, but I think you're doing fine. Those would be my concerns. So nothing really, but I'm watching the data. Well, I'm not going to add anything new. You're going to get your ketometer, and you're going to do whenever you feel comfortable, and you're obviously going to get your keto strips. You throw in some of those numbers, and at least we'll have some early on numbers of what your blood ketones are. I know you've been doing the urine strip, which simply means you're making ketones for sure, and they're going out with your urine. So that will be another variable to look at. I'll encourage you not to be too obsessive about that, but it's a fun new toy. Take it concurrent with when you take your glucose. If you do it once a day, fine. If you do it twice a day, fine. And those are the numbers we're going to look at. And then you can put a little note like you're doing now. This is after working out. This is before bed. This is after whatever. That would be helpful.
Oh, yeah. So today's glucose reading was 71. That was 71 after probably 2.5 to 3 hours after eating this morning. So would it be a little too naive for me to assume, barring, obviously I wasn't able to take a reading, that I'm dipping below 70 at night?
That's fair. They have what it's called the dawn effect. What that simply means is that about 5 a.m. For people who are sleeping regularly, they lived in their part of the world consistently, didn't show up yesterday from China or wherever, is that the dawn effect is that you get a spike in cortisol and testosterone about 5 in the morning. And so cortisol drives the sugar. So when people sometimes wake up, they'll wake up with a fairly high sugar, depending where they were, all insulin sensitivity and so on and so forth. So there should be, relative to this who's ever following, if you did it every hour, or somebody did it every hour through the whole night, you would find that it would rise from 5 to 7 in the morning, and you might see a shadow of that about 8 or so. So that's how nature works. So the fact that if you had pizza the night before, you would have that, elevate all that even higher, but that pattern would still be there. So yes and no, but mostly when you see 70 is a great number. I wouldn't call that low. I'd call that a surprise because you're a newbie again, kind of like you're 66. So you certainly are on a low carb diet. That's check. You got that. And you're not stressed, and you didn't just work out, which is a form of self-induced stress relative to cortisol and sugar and blah, blah, blah. So I'd say not necessarily. If it came back 100, 110, now we know what your pattern is. I'd say, so what'd you have last night? And then it probably would be diet induced that you've digested overnight.
I'm going to ask another question. This is probably getting a little way too far off, but let's say I was eating basically whatever, that included carbs before falling asleep. Do you think it's possible for that to spike enough to possibly wake me up?
Well, sure. So yes, it would be enough for you to wake up. But with this spike, so how that would work, if you had a high carb dinner and not long before you went to bed, which is one of the things that we shouldn't do, have ideally 2 or 3 hours before you've eaten and before you go to bed. So you had this somewhat high carb meal before you went to sleep. What would happen then is while you're sleeping, your glucose would rise. That means it's going to drive your insulin. You're going to get your glucose crash because your insulin drove your glucose down, and your waking up is in response to the insulin pushing your glucose down. So now you have a low glucose in your body. You're a glucose driven person. You're not a ketone driven person. And so your body's saying, hey, we need some more fuel. We're now low. I'm no dummy here. I just read the fuel tank and it was good about an hour ago and now it's low. We got to refuel. Hey, buddy, wake up. Go get a snack, buddy. And so that's kind of how that is. So that's why you would wake up. But that's on a carb metabolism, a carb glucose metabolism. As you shift away from that, your body becomes this whole adaptation, which everybody does in their own time, means that you have this alternative fuel that your body gets comfortable with. So it really has no reason to wake up other than having a full bladder or something like that because you had tea or something the night before. Other than that kind of discomfort, you should be sleeping through the night, or that should become more and more your norm if you're sleeping in an okay area, meaning not bright lights and all this other stuff.
Regarding this last week, I've probably slept all the way through the night for probably at least the last 9-10 days. But that whole waking up at around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning was typical of me literally every day, including weekends, for probably the last 4 or 5 months.
Interesting. So now you kind of know why that is. And specifically since it was 5 or 5-ish, that would be what I would call it an exaggerated dawn effect, meaning we all have the dawn effect regardless of what our diet is, keto or glucose driven, fat or glucose driven, fat or carbs. But you've now exaggerated that whole pattern so it's high enough that your body's saying, wake the frick up now. We've been enduring this torturous, indolence for the night while you're sleeping long enough. Now go get carbs. You're going to hear more and more about the dawn effect, as it's been called. And no, that directly has to do with blood sugar. I think that's a good question. Brian, I appreciate your effort, and I'm seeing the data. And I'm sort of keeping you within the rails in the sense of making sure this is safe, and it is safe. Just remind you about the salt, and I bet you that's going to take a lot of ways. And, I'm the set of eyes over your shoulder. It's nice that you have this program that you've shared with me. So until next week, we'll check in.
Thanks for listening. For anybody who has any questions, feel free to contact me on our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Same name as our podcast. I'm open to any questions, and we plod through the good and the bad, the difficult and the easy, week after week.